What's up, Ego? Welcome to the Cutting Edge Podcast. This is our September 2022 episode where we're going to be discussing temple influence. So, temple influence. We've been talking at length about the four temples: the soul temple, the heart temple, the mind temple, and the body temple. The four temples, etc. And then, like from a macro level, these represent the four sides of the mind of humanity itself. And then there's also at the macro level, and then at the micro level, we have the four sides of the mind for each individual human, basically. And the four sides of the mind that they themselves have within their heads represent one of the four temples. I'm an ENTP, therefore I am a member of the Heart Temple because the ENTP, ISFJ, INTJ, and ESFP are both part of the Heart Temple. And the Heart Temple serves at the feet of extroverted intuition from a perception point of view, as an example. And each of the temples behave in this way. And this is stuff that we've been talking about within season 18. It's also what we have been talking about at length in the Deadly Sins lectures within the premium lecture area as well. So based on that, it's definitely an interesting, new direction that has given us a bunch of new vectors with which to type other people. And those new vectors have been applied at ucha.app, which you guys can all log in and check out, which I highly recommend that you do. Within Ucha, we have in the Type Yourself and the Type Others test. And in the Type Others test, we have the section for like a tab, based on the standard way of using the type grid. And then the temples represent new vectors, new ways with which we can apply the type grid, looking at cognitive origin, looking at deadly sin, living virtue, and also the entire temple themselves as additional vectors. This basically allows you to further refine your deductive reasoning when being able to deduce what type you are, or at least what type other people are within the context of thereof. And this is important when you're refining your decisions as you use the type grid to be able to arrive at an accurate conclusion as to what your type is or what someone else's type is, basically. And that's like the main practical application of the temples. But the purpose of today's podcast is actually going deeper to see how the temples themselves, all four temples, actually have influence on the original temple that is inside of your head and the temple that you represent. And what this does is that it actually creates a subset of behaviors in terms of the four sides of the mind based on the position of the four sides of the mind, where they are within your head, where they are within the temple, basically, and for what temple perspective you are operating on as a person. And it's and that's ultimately what's happening. So based on that, it's necessary to understand, like, hey, there's a whole other layer to this. Obviously we talk about the macro, but we're going to be talking a little bit about the metaphysical impact of the four temples on the micro today, since we've spent so much time outlining the macro. And to do that, we're going to be using the trusty whiteboard as usual, although my whiteboard is not connected. So give me a second here, because I need to connect that. That's kind of embarrassing that it is not connected, but I will connect it now. 1 second. Get my trusty little whiteboard going for you folks. Awesome. Also, I haven't slept, so I'm really exhausted. So yeah, I have a feeling that it's the application is just asleep and it takes a while for it to be turned on. So let's look at Chase here, because why not? And we have ENTP, ego. Then we have INTJ, unconscious. There we go. INTJ, unconscious. ESFP, superego, and then we have ISFJ subconscious. All right, so here's my 4 sides of the mind, and this equals the heart temple. But let's actually look at how the temples themselves actually relate to one another in terms of like their relationship with one another, right? So let's do another one, and let's look at the macro level. Even though my lines are not straight, well, we'll just deal with it. So we have the soul temple, which represents the ego of humanity, basically, and the shadow of the soul temple is the heart temple. This represents the shadow, also known as the unconscious. The superego is the body temple, and this would be so superego. And again, folks, this is the macro perspective. This is the micro perspective. This is me as an individual. And then we have so the soul temple, and then we have the mind temple right here, which is the subconscious. And this is the macro, but this is what is for humanity. This is for humanity, okay? So, all right, thanks, Jay, for being on top of it. Yeah, let's make sure that this is going away. So yeah, the macro equals humanity, and then that's where it is. Now, these relationships, and I'm going to change my ink color here, these relationships matter. So the soul and the heart versus the mind and the body, but then also you have the soul versus the mind and the heart versus the body, okay? So this is where it gets a little weird. So the thing is that regardless of what position these are in the head, in your head, they always will have this relationship, always. So if the heart just happens to be the ego, basically, then that means automatically the soul will become the shadow, okay? And conversely, if the superego ends up becoming the subconscious, then that means that this is ultimately the superego. So you have to be aware that they flip back and forth and flip up and down in terms of axis and orbit, etc. These relationships still all the way maintain because like we cognitive transition to the other sides of our mind, so also from a macro perspective, from a humanity perspective, from that point of view, we are also able to transition with the 4 temples, okay? So that itself is a really, really big deal, okay? So what ends up happening is that, with the ENTP being in the ego, that means the soul is exerting influence upon my ego, right? And that basically means that the INTJ is also in the heart position. And then the ISFJ is in the mind position. And the ESFP is within the body position, okay? So why does that matter? Well, the soul is all about character, right? That's what it's making out to be. The heart is all about passion. The body is all about legacy. And then the mind temple is all about learning, right? So these are what we call the temple influences, how each of the individual, basically from the macro perspective of humanity, we have ego, the subconscious, the unconscious, and the superego. Each of these positions take an effect directly upon your own 4 sides of the mind, within your own temple, within your own head. I'm an ENTP, so I'm a heart temple, and the ENTP ego takes the soul position within the 4 sides of the mind. Just like my INTJ is taking the heart passion position within my mind as a shadow, and then the ISFJ is taking the mind position. So whenever I'm doing anything learning related, it's often filtered through ISFJ. When it comes to leaving a legacy behind, it's filtered through my ESFP superego, basically, right? because the body temple itself is actually influencing my superego, in as much as the heart temple itself is influencing my INTJ, right? So that means my INTJ, it's like double passionate. It's already in my mind as the four sides, because it's like, hey, it's already a member of the mind or of the heart temple, but then it's also being further influenced by the heart. And this is one of the reasons why, for example, like an ENTP would be really good at say, poetry. Very good at poetry. Very good at writing, even songwriting to a point, right? This is where all these like little sub traits and sub skills come from. I leave a legacy behind, and I achieve that legacy through my superego likes to shame other people. It loves to shame. It likes to be that dualist. It leaves a legacy by having a legacy of debate left over, basically a legacy of dissertation and learning, constantly learning skills and skilling up from an ISFJ perspective, taking risks with learning. So like, for example, this could be like me reading banned books or books that are unpopular or books that challenge ego investments. Ego investment challenge. You know, that is a way that the temples are influencing my brain, basically. And the ENTP ego, which is influenced by the soul temple, it's acting in such a way where, you know, my own character is based on me being like a good ENTP. You see what I'm saying? Or an ENTP with high moral fiber, as much as that's even possible with an FI trickster coming in my passionate INTJ shadow, basically. But the soul temple is influencing my ENTP ego, even though the ENTP ego is actually a part of the heart temple at a macro level. But this is what's happening on a micro level. Character, the soul temple is expressing itself through my ENTP ego. And this is how, if you think about it, all of the 16 types ultimately can be expressed through the lens or the filter of all of the four temples within every single human being out there, right? Every human being out there ends up having the opportunity to play out or become aspects of each of the four temples within their own four sides of the mind. Literally. That's what ends up happening. So it's interesting. And by the way, this is not the only way to interpret this. There's another way to interpret temple influence. This is one way. The other way to interpret temple influence. Let's show you guys the other way. Let's use a different way of doing it. Let me use a different color. Let's use green for this. But you could imagine, let's say that your ego is actually just, you know, that's what the heart temple is. But then because the heart is up here with that would make the soul actually your shadow. So this is the other way to interpret it. This is like the reverse polarity. Okay? So, okay, then heart and soul, and then heart is always across the body, which means the body temple would be expressed, you know, this is like the shadow polarity, basically, okay? Would be expressed through the ISFJ, right? And then also the mind temple would be expressed through the ESFP, right? And its influence, right? So you have these different temple influences happening at the same time. So you have a primary temple and a secondary temple influencing each of the four sides of your mind simultaneously. It's like having the ego and the shadow temple influences that are influencing each of the four sides of the mind at all times. And what this causes is certain behaviors, right? And then you get to see, like, for example, you have soul and heart in your shadow, but you also have soul and heart in your ego being represented equally. Not necessarily equally because one's primary and one's secondary, but based on how you cognitive transition, the behaviors that are attached with those specific temples change. Depending on, is it an orderly transition? Is it a chaotic transition? You know, we just don't know. How's your gateway functions doing? What about the guidance functions that are guiding those gateway functions? How are they functioning, right? And this literally translates into how your individual behaviors as a person are coming out from a micro perspective, a very, very micro perspective, right? This is why, like, for example, I can make arguments, when it comes to typing people. This is some of the things that, like, TE users really, really struggle. So, like, for example, we have Color of the Sky here in the live stream chat. And him and I had a big discussion recently about, the value of deduction versus induction. Induction being a process of qualification when it comes to typing people. And the thing is that there is no actual real way to use induction to type a person accurately. The reason why is because of how mathematics fundamentally works in of its own right. Because if you're using induction, that means you're forced to use addition in order to come up with your conclusion. So here's an example. We always use the duck example to explain inductive reasoning, which is, hey, if it walks like a duck, talks like a duck, sounds like a duck, looks like a duck, is shaped like a duck, smells like a duck, well, then it's safe to assume that it's a duck. But what if it's actually a swan? What if it's a goose? You see? What if it's not actually that? So because of that, like, addition, if you're using inductive reasoning, you have to first assume that the person that you're typing is lacking traits entirely. In order for inductive reasoning to go, that would basically mean human beings are so simple that they would have to be lacking in traits. But that's not true. Temple influence, as I'm presenting it to you here within the context of this podcast, is that everybody is actually everything. Everybody has every cognitive function. Everybody has every temple. And it gets even more muddy when you consider cognitive transition. You consider orderly versus chaotic transition. You consider where the guidance functions are, which are basically the parent functions of each of the four sides of the mind based on how they're transitioning. All of these different intricacies change consistently. And using a system of qualification, aka induction, aka a system of addition, it's impossible. Because in order to use addition, you have to assume that a human being is not everything at once. Because they're trying to put XYZ building blocks together to draw a conclusion from. Therefore, this is entirely irrational. Because the truth is that a human being is every trait. Every human being has every trait psychologically. The question is actually, which traits do they have less of, and which traits do they have more of? This is why you have to use a system of deduction, also known as subtraction, in order to come up with your conclusion in typing a person. So based on that, because of that assumption that everybody is everything, you just basically subtract the attributes or the traits that they are less of while keeping what they have more of, and then you look to see, okay, these are the leftover traits that they have more of. Which of the 16 types of those traits actually apply to? Okay, and that is how that is the system of typing that we should all be following, to do this. But setting up a system of qualification, it's technically based on the nature of mathematics. You cannot use addition, because in order for you to use addition or a system of qualification, you have to assume that the thing you're qualifying does not have all of the traits. And that's wrong. This is why extroverted thinkers consistently mistype people, because they think that they can follow a system of qualification to arrive at a correct answer, and they cannot. They have to use a system of deduction, which is you assume that everyone is everything. You just have to identify the things they are less of compared to the things that they are more of. And then subtract the things that they are less of, look at the remainder of what they are more of, and then draw your conclusion. That's far more accurate and can lead to accurate typings, versus a system of induction cannot. And temporal influence, is what I'm presenting you here, is an excellent example of that on a consistent basis. So what ends up happening then is that, like, this ends up dominating our behavior. in a lot of ways, just from a nature standpoint. And again, we're not talking nurture right now. We'll get to nurture soon. I'm going to talk a little bit about octogram. But this is ultimately how nature works. You have a primary and secondary temple influencing each of the four sides of your mind, okay? And, the ENTP, ego, ends up having heart and soul. The INTJ, unconscious, has heart and soul. But then your ISFJ subconscious has body and mind. And same also with your superego. And each of these, the shadow temple versus the ego temple, or your primary temple versus the secondary temple, that may be influencing your subconscious, for example. When you transition into your subconscious in an orderly or a chaotic manner, guess what? The temple influence that is influencing that side of your mind ends up creating various behaviors, right? Various behaviors. The question is that which one is primary and secondary? And the jury is still out on that. We don't actually know that entirely yet. We're still experimenting, we're still researching, we're still discussing that amongst ourselves within the inner circle. But really, we're not entirely sure. I can actually make an argument for both. I can make an argument that because the ENTP ego is a member of the heart temple, that means the heart temple is ultimately primary, at a micro level. But then again, I could also look at the macro level and make the argument that it's an ENTP ego that's expressing itself, from a soulful point of view. So is the ENTP ego leading with passion, or is the ENTP ego leading with character, primarily, right? The thing is, though, is that I suspect that this is where human nurture comes into play. Looking at these various behaviors, because which of the temples that are influencing each of the four sides of the mind, like how exactly are they manifesting our behaviors from a nature point of view? Well, I'm coming to believe that it's possible from an octogram perspective that nurture is potentially providing its own influence on our four sides, which is causing us to lead with a certain temple influence within each of the four sides of our mind. Okay? That's why it's on the Cutting Edge podcast, because this is a current question mark that we have right now. We're not entirely sure which one is leading. We're not entirely sure which is the default. We know that they're both there. We know that it's happening, but being able to figure out, okay, this is the one this is one that's leading, okay, well, great. But what does orderly transition have to do with that? What does a chaotic transition have to do with that? What about the guidance functions? Because the idea that now that there's two potential temples that are influencing each of the four sides of the mind instead of just one temple, which is what was previously believed, is not something that has been heavily discussed or even looked at. Because the reality of the situation is that, ENTP is a member of the heart temple. I can make an argument that it's leading with the heart, and then it's the INTJ that is becoming, the soul temple. However, the soul temple itself is the ego within humanity itself. What if my ENTP ego is actually the soul temple's manifestation within my own mind? I can argue both ways. Very easily. I suspect that based on their octogram will tell us or indicate to us, okay, this is the order with which the ego is leading with its own temple, or if it's leading with the other temple, from the macro or the micro. Which is it submitting to the micro, or is it submitting to the macro? We don't exactly know yet, but both arguments can be made. And if it has nothing to do with the octogram, then the other thing it has to do with is basically chaotic versus orderly transition, right? But what we don't know is does the chaotic versus orderly transition, does it apply directly to the micro, or does it apply directly to the macro? We don't know yet. And it's going to take some time to actually observe this among people, within the community, people that we know personally, in order to see and observe and gather the evidence up to actually find out what exactly is happening here. Because, this is super meta, folks. This is super metaphysical. And it really just comes down to being able to categorize potential behaviors, natural behaviors versus nurtural behaviors that are being attached to both. Because we have to keep track of nature versus nurture. We got to keep track of orderly versus chaotic transition. We got to keep track of gateway functions. We got to keep track of guidance functions. We got to keep track of axis, orbit, and reflection all at the same time, and how each of those things are working together. But what we do know is that the temples themselves are exerting influence directly over the four sides of the mind. How they are doing it, we don't exactly know yet. However, there is a logical way to present it such that we know that the outcome would always be the same given XYZ input. There is some TI here. The thing is that we haven't had adequate time to test the input versus the output and to be able to generate proper feedback to know exactly what the system is. But what we do know is that these temples are influencing each of the four sides. It is happening, right? And it ends up creating various behaviors. If the ESFP is focusing on leaving, if it's being heavily influenced by the body temple, it's going to behave in a certain way where its legacy could be, dueling, shaming, debate, or it could be all about learning lessons and using the ESFP to teach other people lessons, right? They deserve this. They deserve to be taught a lesson. That would be the mind temple influence over the ESFP. And that could potentially be a shadow influence, or it could be an ego influence. We don't know. Primary influence or a secondary influence. It all depends. And it depends, and transition is probably the easiest way to handle it, because it's like from a chaotic transition in the ESFP, does that mean that the body temple is influencing my superego more? Or does that mean that the mind temple is influencing it more, right? Because of, positive and negative. It's literally acting the same way as electricity. And the gateway functions are like diodes, right? And whereas, and the guidance functions are conductors. Looking at our brains, it's literally like a cognitive circuit board. That's how it works. And then just understanding that there's potentially two temples that are influencing each of the individual four sides of the mind, which can also potentially influence and dictate behavior from a nature perspective, that's mind-boggling. It's insane. It's a ton of data. It's a ton of information. It just goes to show that our minds literally are full of unlimited potential and ultimately universes in of their own right because of this model. It shows you just how big our psyches actually are. They're gigantic. They're huge. They are literal universes within their own right. So based on that, hold on. Let's see if we got a question here. Yeah, Kelly, that answers the question, basically. And again, that's just the nature side. And if you're looking at the nurture side from like an octagram perspective, you could probably even utilize temple influence to even actually, to look at various behaviors that are assigned to each of the temple influences, basically, and then use those behaviors to be like, hey, does this mean I'm subconscious developed? Does this mean I'm unconscious developed? And you look at those behaviors compared to other people, right? See, that's the thing. That's the thing. Because the macro and the micro are present. You can basically see the micro as the shadow of the macro ego, basically, which would beg to differ, which would beg to be like that, potentially we could assume that, like the heart temple, my ENTP ego is primary, and the soul temple, my ENTP ego is actually secondary. And then vice versa for the INTJ shadow. Based on, if we were to assume that premise, it can actually start to fit. However, we haven't collected enough evidence to actually know for sure. So that would be the working model that I would submit to you and submit to this audience. But at the end of the day, we're not entirely sure yet. This leads, we need to have a lot more discussion with this within the community to actually understand that. Because we could see the results. We could see the results looking at people's octagram. If someone is more shadow, if someone's more unconscious developed through their octagram, they're having more orderly transitions into their unconscious, right? Versus their subconscious, right? It's more chaotic, based on their octagram. So octagram kind of can help us, give us a little bit of a guide in terms of, how people are transitioning, and at least how they prefer to transition. Because remember, guys, like all of this really comes down to, like, for example, handedness. It comes down to preference. Do people prefer using their left hand versus their right hand? That matters, okay? And understanding those differences is absolutely key when it comes to being able to predict behavior as a result of this model. This is where we can get into some serious predictive analytics, because we would be able to actually start assigning specific behaviors, even specific tasks or specific challenges that are applied to different egos, and then compare that data directly with a person's known octogram and where they're at in their life at that moment in time. If all their behavior was being tracked and we could cross-reference it, there would be a pattern. And the temple influence would be basically the Rosetta Stone to be able to unlock what that pattern actually is, to be able to map it out correctly. But in order to even accomplish that feat, that data feat, we would have to get to a point where it's like, hey, what is primary and what is secondary? What is the primary temple and what is the secondary temple influencing? And does it change? Does it switch? Does it have to do with orderly versus chaotic transitioning? Right? Does it have to do with their octogram? I think the octogram, because it's neutral, it's the outcome. I don't think it's the cause, right? I think how a person is transitioning and how they're using their transitions and how developed their guidance functions are and how they're using their gateway functions, I think that is probably the best way to determine whether or not the specific temple is, how each temple is influencing the four sides of the mind. And I think that is a safer route for us to go, because octogram, because it's neutral, it's technically more a result instead of a starting point. It's an outcome. It's not the start, right? Because it's neutral. Yes, neutral can represent input that can affect our nature, but the nature came first. It's kind of, you get into a chicken versus an egg argument. And the reality is that the true answer to the chicken and the egg is that the chicken came first. That's reality. It did. Just as much as we can be like, okay, yeah, the ego came first. Our minds came first. Then everything else after the fact, that's ultimately neutral impact that is influencing our minds to behave in a certain way. And temple influence basically is just a way to help you categorize particular behaviors that could help you potentially predict, okay, it could help you predict their octogram, for one. Definitely. You could do that. But you could also see which behaviors, positive or negative, depending on what you categorize as a positive or negative behavior, but which behaviors are more likely to manifest out of a human being's nature based on how they're using their guidance functions versus their gateway functions from a chaotic versus orderly transition. If you want to learn more about chaotic versus orderly transition, I highly, highly recommend you guys watch Season 19. Season 19 is available at csjoseph.life/portal, and the Discover XYZ type logins. You just go in there and then watch the videos associated with each of the 16 types, because that's where you will find that information. So, yeah. All right, guys, if you have questions, go ahead. This is... but looking at these different things, it's like it's very obvious to me, like at a minimum, though, that my ENTP ego, it can lead with the passion of heart and it can lead with the character of the soul. It really can. And then if you think about it this way, like for example, if John Bodine was actually present on this live stream, he would start talking about the temple wheels, because it's like, okay, hold on, you have the shadow and the aspirational pole, which means you could have an aspirational temple influencing your ego, and you can have a shadow temple influencing your ego. And those could be directly applied to what we call the temple wheels, where we have the shadow pole and the aspiration pole. So like for myself, that is, malevolence, which is the shadow pole, versus fanaticism, which is the aspiration pole. Am I being malevolent with character? Well, what about the living virtue? Like, where am I passionately being compassionate to others, or is that actually more of a character trait within the soul temple? Right? Is my envy actually coming, from the passion of the heart? Is that how the temple is influencing my ego? You see what I'm saying, folks? There's all these other little components here that could also help us indicate specifically what's happening. And it's also actually a different vector entirely when you consider temple influence for navigating the type grid. It is. if you're using the shadow versus the aspiration poles, which we're going to be talking about a lot in the very near future, especially with season 18. But in order to get to that point, we needed to talk about temple influence from this perspective so that we'd be able to actually, present and speak on those, appropriately, because most people have no idea that the temples themselves are influencing each of the four sides of the mind at all times. And then like we have an aspiration pole and a shadow pole, we have an aspiration temple and a shadow temple that's attached to each of the four sides of our mind that are influencing each of the four sides. That's staggering if you think about it. And it just shows you like how much of a polyhedron our heads actually are from all these unique perspectives. And then how you can categorize behavior based on aspiration versus shadow behavior and attach each of those to each of the four sides of the mind within the temple that's in our own head. You see what I'm saying, folks? It is extremely complex, but doable. You could actually have a spreadsheet to potentially keep track of all of this. But it can actually show you, and ultimately, because of temple influence and because of these categorization of behaviors, you could potentially predict their octogram. You could predict their nurture very easily and the direction that their life is going to go based on how they're behaving now, and then what potential pathways for behavior they have later. And then also you could even use that to anticipate how their quarter-life crisis, midlife crisis, three-quarter-life crisis, and ultimately their final life crisis are actually going to end up manifesting from beyond that, all as a result of temple influence, right? Same thing goes with chaotic versus orderly transition, where their guidance functions are. Potentially you could use temple influence to actually check the development of their guidance function and see are they more likely to chaotic transition or orderly transition from their ego to their subconscious or from their ego into their unconscious, right? You could see that happening, and then obviously, the octogram would be the result to be like, okay, this is where this person's been and this is where this person is currently going right now, right? And all that information is available to you. It's just really coming down to are we 100% sure that we know which temple influence is primary versus secondary, which one is aspirational and which one is shadow within the four sides, which one is impacting the ego. And we just need to focus on the ego because the ego itself is primary overall. Because once we understand what's happening to the ego within the shadow pole, the aspiration pole, and where that connects to the two temples that are influencing it, the shadow temple versus the aspiration temple influence for the ego itself, then we could actually predict the rest of the model and then predict the behavior as a result. And then we could see we could anticipate potential nurtural blowback and how their nurture would change over time, and then what octograms they may be at certain times throughout their life. An AI system could easily do that. It is possible. We just have to categorize behaviors under certain subsets and under certain circumstances and at certain times to be able to do that. It is possible. So yeah. Okay, so let's look at some of the questions here. I do have more questions than you, Color, because this is extremely cerebral. But like I said, my current instinct, my current gut instinct with my expert intuition is like I said, using the temple wheels and seeing the shadow pole versus the aspiration pole. I believe they directly map to what the shadow temple is versus the aspiration temple in terms of which temples are influencing each of the individual four sides of the mind. I believe that is the pathway with which we can anticipate temple influence and the behaviors as a result of temple influence. I believe that's the key. I think that's the direction we need to go. But I'm not sure yet. I'm not 100% sure. That's my gut feel. And that's why this is a cutting edge podcast episode. But I'm not entirely, I'm not dead on sure with it. Because I can still internally make arguments for and against. But that's my gut feel right now. That's 6 out of 10 for me right now. The direction as to where this should go. But I could be wrong. I'm going to go the other direction and do the reverse and look at octogram and different octograms of same types and see if it still fits. Because octogram is ultimately the outcome, whereas this is kind of more natural. Natural instead of nurtural. Okay. Okay. So on top of octagram, we might have to add temple influence to our labels. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because my thought on that, Lev, is that if we know a person's octagram, we should be able to reverse engineer a person's octagram to actually be able to state what the temple influence actually is. I understand from your rational perspective, you want to use temple influence as a way to detect octagram, which technically, logically speaking, that would be true. But I think we're going to have to work in reverse and deduce our way to there. But again, that's my TI logic bias saying that. You might be correct. Crying and TE trickster, says Robert Potts. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, rivalrous stare at TE nemesis. Okay, so color has a question. Does the functions of the temples have any influence? The answer is yes. They absolutely do. The functions of the temples have influence, yes. So, like, for example, heart is the NI, right? And then soul is the NE. But then you have NI and E present, but then also soul is the FI, right? And then the FI and the FE is also the heart, basically. So those functions also play in, and knowing those functions playing in also will help you detect which specific behaviors are attributed to the shadow temple versus the aspirational temple as applied to each of the four sides of the mind, basically. Okay, so great question, Color. Thank you for asking that. Lev asks, if we could figure this out, we have our next Tower of Babel. If you can balance the rest of one's mind, expanding that to the macro would lead to everyone's enlightenment. Sort of. I think Chris Taylor would take a huge umbrage to that statement entirely, Lev. It's more of we're just going to be on the next step. It's really all about the next step. So I'm not entirely sure we could say that that's the entire thing. But the point is that the layer of temple influence really can scarily provide an entirely new way to predict human behavior ahead of time. The thing is that if we know their type and we know their octagram, if we know those things, then we can solve for temple influence behavior. If we know their type and we know their temple influence behavior, we can solve for octagram. If we know their octagram, we know their temple influence behavior, we can solve for their type. It's literally just algebra, folks. It's algebra. You just have to be able to track all of this data in one place and just solve for what's missing. It's algebra. And this is just another variable within the algebraic equation that helps us identify our Jungian psychology, our psyche, basically. Which of the 16 types, how does it behave? What's the neutral component, right? It's just another way to see or classify based on looking at behavioral dichotomies. Because that dichotomy is literally shadow temple influence versus aspirational temple influence on a particular side of the mind within your own temple inside of your own head. Right? That's what it is. So, yes, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That is correct. Thank you. He beat me to the punch. Dang it, Lev. So, anyway, yeah. So yeah, that's basically what I had in mind to present for this cutting edge episode. If you guys have any questions, now would be the time. Any questions relating to this? Go ahead. It just gives you another way to solve. The other thing too is like you can look at these temple influences also, I believe, as a way to predict chaotic versus orderly transition as well. So it all works together, folks. If you have some of the other pieces, you can find the other piece. It's very, very simple. So this is like a very macro way of looking at the type grid. And you can imagine like different grids working together because you can kind of look at the temples of it as its own kind of type grid to a point. You can and then like how the influences are going. We have all these different knobs to turn to basically see, what the actual result is. that's going on with our heads, basically. Yes. All right, so Sarah's question, which we've been waiting long enough for, so hopefully she can get it out before the show is over, because the show is technically over at this point. So let's give her a minute to type it out succinctly without it being a big story. Please. So anyway, and remember, folks, like, because some of you joined late, you really have to understand. You really have to understand from this perspective right here. Looking at the whiteboard, macro equals humanity. You have to always know that whatever position they're in, the soul and the heart and the mind and the body, whatever position they're in, they all have the same relationship with each other. They always have the same relationship. So if the heart is in the ego, the soul is in the shadow. If the body is in the subconscious, that means the mind is in the superego. If the mind is in the shadow, that means the body is in the ego. Okay? They all have the same relationship always. And that never changes. And that's why it's really important to know temple influence between your shadow temple and your aspiration temple that is affecting each of the four sides. Okay? We know it's happening. We just don't exactly know if it's primary and secondary. And like I said earlier in the show, my theory is based on a person's guidance functions and how they're using their gateway functions, and is one way to determine it, or also look at what their preferred poles are. The aspiration pole versus the shadow pole from a temple perspective, the temple wheels, as presented, which includes their living virtue, their deadly sin, etc., as well, and their cognitive origin. Okay? Looking at it from that perspective, we should also be able to draw a similar conclusion, if not the same conclusion. So Andrew says the inverse of ourselves would be how we can predict and search for romantic partners. Yes, technically, but I would not say that, because while you're putting a lot of emphasis on compatibility, there is still camaraderie with this, and that too has value. I don't really like how people just completely take a companion-based relationship or a entry-based relationship and throw the baby out with the bathwater on that, because those relationships still have value. Having a partial camaraderie-based relationship still has value. And don't forget, Andrus, remember, men overvalue compatibility compared to women undervaluing compatibility. Women, because when the women get together, they're more pragmatic, a gender, pragmatic, a sex. They have higher value on camaraderie than men do. Because men, when they come together, they're more affiliative. They have higher value on compatibility due to that affiliative nature when men come together and are together. So that affects it too. Like their gender, and not the gender they identify with, their born gender, their gender nature, basically the nature that's attached to the gender, definitely plays out no matter what. Okay, so shadow, what I said, shadow focused and shadow developed, like those could be technically the same. So yeah. Yes, I understand you want all four, Andrus. I get it. That's no problem. And no one's planning on limiting themselves. But I just wanted you guys to understand, like, from an evolutionary psychology perspective, that matters. And we're going to be talking, in the next Cutting Edge episode, we're actually going to be going deep into evolutionary psychology. And we're going to talk about how evolutionary psychology matters and how it's affecting us on a day-to-day lives and how our genes are actually matters. And it'll help us get closer to understanding exactly how our psyches determine our genes and not the other way around, basically. Or at least there's a yin and yang equilibrium with our psyche being primary, with genes being secondary, with the production. So, yes, sub-focus, shadow developed. Yes, so you are SD, or you are UDSF, Sarah. That's correct. So yeah, but yeah, the next episode we're going to be discussing evolutionary psychology. I've dropped a few nuggets already on the YouTube channel, on the podcast, talking about it, but all of that is especially necessary from a nature perspective because it directly impacts nurture, and we're going to be discussing that in the next episode of Cutting Edge. So it's going to be really fantastic. Sarah is taking way too long. And I'm about to end the episode, so she needs to hurry up, just spit it out already. So I think everything is bidirectional. All right, so Phipps says, in chess, you make sacrifices to win the game. Do you believe you make psychological sacrifices in order to win? Absolutely. It comes with the territory of being unconscious developed. Most UD types end up having to sacrifice their ego for the sake of survival. That's what it is to be unconscious developed. All right, Sarah says, why do you think that people are having a hard time going to the unconscious when just coming from you, the happiness is in the subconscious? Because they need to survive. Because their subconscious is not necessary for survival. Survival requires maturity. Do you think an immature person has a higher chance of surviving? No, they don't. So, don't negative me. That's mean. All right, cool. That's it for this episode. Thank you all for watching and listening. I'll see you guys next month on Cutting Edge Podcast for October 2022, where we will be discussing evolutionary psychology. I'll see you guys then on the next episode. Later.